Hello, so today's video is about the Canon 70-300mm f4 to 5.6L lens. Now, I've been using this lens for the last couple of years, and I'm just going to give some of my thoughts and opinions about it from the perspective of a professional photographer that's been using Canon cameras for many years. So to begin with, I'll just show you a few of the pictures that I've taken with it so you can get an idea of the kind of work that I've been producing with this lens, and then I'll come back to talk about some of my experiences of shooting with it, some of the good and bad things. So just a bit of background to start off with. I never thought that I would ever be a 70-300mm kind of guy. I've always been a 70-200 F2.8 kind of photographer, as many other professional photographers are. And I'd also use the 300mm f4 prime if I needed a bit of extra length, or the 500 or 600mm if the need arose. Now, a few years ago, a travel assignment arrived, and it became clear that it was going to be a pretty heavy-duty mission where I was going to be on my feet from sunrise until sunset for multiple days. And so I quickly realised that I just didn't want to be carrying this little combo with me the whole time. It's heavy and big and complicated. And I just needed to kind of shed some weight and some size from my gear. I wanted a system that I could just carry with me for the whole day and not have to worry about overburdening myself, because then the photography can start to suffer. And so I looked at a few different options and quickly came to the conclusion that this 70-300 was probably the best option. Looked at the 100-400, but found it a bit big and a bit heavy, and I didn't really need a 400mm option. And actually, having used this 70-200 for so long, it's become almost bionic connection for me. And I didn't like the idea of not being able to get to 70mm. I kind of just like that, the ability, my brain thinks in terms of 70mm being the wide open option on my telephoto lens, and when I couldn't find that on the 100-400, I just found it a little bit frustrating. Not everyone will have different opinions about these, but that's why I arrived at this point, because the focal length was right for me, the weight was right for me, and so I bought one second hand actually, and I thought that I would go on that shoot and do the pictures that I needed to, and then come back, and then this lens would go onto the shelf, and this one would become my kind of daily telephoto, if you like, as it has been for many years. However, when I came back and processed the pictures and everything was said and done, this lens has not really been used very much ever since, nor the 300, and this 70-300 has become my daily telephoto, if you like. What I am going to do is just talk about the lens in terms of some different elements, so that we can discuss what's important to me and might be important to you as well, and sort of move through the different elements. What's good, what's bad, if you like. And feel free to leave me a comment if you've got any thoughts about this lens, because I'd love to hear what your experiences have been, and I'm sure other people would like to hear your experiences as well in the comments, because that's really important to kind of get this overall feel of how multiple people feel about lenses rather than just from one perspective. So the first thing I want to talk about is image sharpness, image quality. That's the most important thing from any lens for me. A lens can have multiple other qualities, but if it's not consistently sharp, then that's a real problem for me as a professional. I need sharp images, and if it's sharp, I can get around most of the other issues. And so the image from this lens is exceedingly sharp all the way through the focal lengths and all the way through the apertures. I think it starts to get a little bit less good at, let's say, f16 or f22, but I very rarely shoot at those apertures. I have had no problem from the center of the image to the edge of the image. I'm not a technical chartsy kind of lens person. I'm somebody that looks at the pictures and they're either consistently sharp, or I notice a problem. And if I notice a problem, then basically the lens is no good to me. Haven't had that issue with this lens at all, and I've been surprised at the sharpness. You know, in AI servo, one shot, it's consistently good. The image stabilization is really good as well. The out of focus elements of the pictures look really nice, and the contrast and color rendition is really nice, which kind of brings me on to the next thing. So after sharpness, there's basically it's the feel of, do I like the feel of the image that the lens produces? And I do have some lenses that are exceedingly technically sharp, but I just don't really like the pictures that come out of them. I do like the pictures that come out of this. I really like the feel of the pictures. No problem at all. I think a telephoto lens has a slightly different feel to, let's say, a wide angle or a standard focal length in terms of what it is that you're looking for and what it is that you like about the image. And I have no problem at all with how the pictures look from this lens. Obviously you can't get as out of focus background as you can with, say, the 70-200 2.8 because you don't have the maximum aperture, but there are things that you can do about that, you know, in terms of how you're using how you're taking your picture, how you're using your camera, how you're using your lens, and how you're sort of thinking as a photographer to help with that. But you know, if extremely out of focus backgrounds are your thing, then you will need a lens with a slightly more wide open aperture. But for me, in general use, I have no issue at all. And in general use with the 70-200, I would generally stop down, you know, at least half or one stop in order to get critical focus most of the time. Anyway, so effectively, they're not that different. The next thing I want to talk about is handling. You know, how does it feel in the hand? How does it handle, or the build quality of the lens, the location of the controls, that kind of thing. And the build quality is great. The build quality is the same as pretty much every other L lens. It's nice and light, which makes a huge difference. I think I mentioned this before, but it really is. It's a sweet spot of versatility in terms of the focal length and the weight. The controls, you know, it has the normal AF and image stabilizing controls here. This is one thing that I'm not keen on, although I've worked around it, is the fact that the focal ring is at the back of the lens and the zoom ring is out here at the front. Now, coming from my 2.8 70-200, I'm really used to the zoom ring being at the back, and so it took me a while to configure my brain to work with that. And I kind of wish that it was the other way around still, to be honest. But once you're reprogrammed, it's not too much of a problem at all to get your hand out there. And I actually end up, I've got into a bad habit of just using it, of just holding the lens hood and zooming with the push-pull technique. Either one. I'm sure that, you know, I'm a bit of a Philistine and I just grab it and pull, but most people will get used to it quite quickly. It does have a lock on here, which means that you can lock it at 70mm, so you don't get zoom creep if you're walking around with it around your shoulder. I don't use the locks, I've not experienced zoom creep with it. And actually that's kind of quite an important element, because a telephoto lens like this, you know, for my kind of shooting a lot of the time, it won't be the lens that I'm working with all of the time. It will be a lens that's either in a pouch or in a backpack or on another camera around my other shoulder. And this lens is kind of compact like that. It's quite nice. You're not aware of it, especially in a pouch, whereas the 70-200 kind of banging around is kind of a little bit heftier and certainly heavier. And so the handling of it like that is, you know, it's significantly lighter than the 70-200. Now, I should talk at this point about the fact that it won't be replacing my 70-200, and I think a lot of professional photographers would probably end up saying the same thing, that the 70-200 2.8 has a special place in most of our hearts, and it comes from the time of of film, actually, and early digital, when you really needed that f2.8 aperture. You know, if you were shooting football or you were shooting something in dark light, in order to get a good enough shutter, a fast enough shutter speed, or certainly even being able to take pictures, to make certain pictures possible at all, you needed the 2.8 aperture. And that still holds true now, actually, that there will still be times where the 70-200 2.8 is essential. And, you know, I'll give you a couple of examples. One being photographing a cruise ship arriving at dawn in gloomy conditions from a speedboat in the middle of the ocean, where there's just no light. And, you know, I think I've shot this particular assignment, and I think I shot the maximum aperture on my camera at that time, and I think I was shooting f2.8, and the light value was sort of 60th of a second, which is really low. And it was just about possible with the 70-200. There's no option of saying to your client that you couldn't take a picture because it was too dark. You just have to find a way around it. And this lens gave me a way around it because I could get the picture. And bearing in mind there's movement on the speedboat, so you can't use a tripod or anything. You know, you need a shutter speed that's just about high enough. And this lens got me the picture, whereas this lens wouldn't, because I'd have been shooting at 15th of a second, and that would have been too slow. I'd have got movement. Certainly on most of the pictures I'd have got movement. And then I'd give you another example. I shot a kind of high-class dining event where people were tasting very expensive wines recently, a very posh hotel. I say recently, this is pre-COVID. And it was all candle lit, and I needed to be a certain distance away, but we wanted lots of pictures of kind of the wines and the candles and people's faces. And it was just so dark that even with the Canon 5D Mark IV or 3, I can't remember which I was shooting with, which are both good high ISO cameras, it was still so dark that the 2.8 aperture was just the only way to be able to get any kind of image. And actually I was using fast primes as well, but that enabled me to have a telephoto option that worked, whereas this just would not have enabled me to work. So if you like shooting in very low light conditions, then the 2.8 lens is definitely the way to go. Or if you're a professional that sometimes works in very low light conditions, you'll probably still need to keep hold of the 70-200 2.8, I would suggest. But as a kind of lens that's an extra to this, it's certainly very, very worthwhile. I suppose we should talk about price, because this lens is expensive. It's over £1,000, and I think there are newer versions of the 70-300 USM lens which have quite good reviews now. I've not used them personally. I will always stick with the Canon L lenses when I can, because they've been really good for me over the years. You know, this lens I bought in 1995, believe it or not, and it still works fine. It's battered to pieces, but it still works fine. It still has value to me. It still has value probably, you know, to somebody else as well. Certainly not the new price, but they do hold their value very well. This is the second 70-200 2.8 I've had over the last 20 years. The first one, it didn't stop working, it just became increasingly unreliable, partly because I dropped it so many times. This one's still fine after 10 years, still works fine, still sharp, you know, and they hold their value very well. They're ultra reliable, and the build quality is amazing. I don't know quite how they build them, but they seem to just go on, you know, so long as you don't drop them, they go on forever. So I'd have no problems at all recommending this lens to anybody that is looking for a good telephoto lens. The 70-300 is my new sweet spot. I think it's brilliant. The whole thing fits into the hand very nicely and is easy to carry, and in many ways is kind of a more modern solution, because with high ISO cameras capability for most people, for most uses, we don't need f2.8 anymore, and 5.6 or f4 is absolutely fine. And so, you know, with the adapter, this would go onto the mirrorless cameras as well, and I've used it with the R5 and it's absolutely fine. Also with a crop sensor body, like let's say the 80D, 90D or 7D, holy moly, this becomes a 480mm. I mean, which is mind-blowing. You know, what a great compact solution that would be. So I have no problem recommending it. If your requirements are for low light, then you'll need to look at other options. And if your requirement is for, let's say, what specific wildlife or specific sports photography, you might need to look at other options as well. But for kind of a middle of the range, middle of the road, compromised telephoto lens for a sort of high-end Canon camera for multiple uses. I couldn't recommend this lens enough. Please do leave me your comments. I'd love to know what you think, and other lenses that you might have found that you think are better or worse, or you've had different experiences with. Leave me your comments, and please do subscribe if you like this kind of content. Thank you very much. Goodbye.